Imagine an empire at the height of its power, marble temples glistening under the Mediterranean sun, senators draped in spotless togas, and soldiers marching beneath crimson standards. Rome, the eternal city, was the beating heart of the ancient world. Its emperors ruled continents. Its legions brought both civilization and terror. But behind the grandeur, beneath the marble and gold, there was something darker. A world of excess, lust, and obsession that even Roman historians struggled to put into words. And at the center of one of Rome's most perverse periods stood a woman whose name still echoes in whispers, Messalina, the empress who shocked an empire. Welcome to Histories of Desire, the channel where we uncover the forbidden side of history, where power and pleasure collided, and the world's most powerful empires indulged their darkest fantasies. Today, we're descending into the scandal-filled court of Emperor Claudius, and the story of the woman who became Rome's most notorious seductress. Some say she was misunderstood. Others call her the original femme fatale, an empress whose appetites knew no bounds. But whatever the truth, her legend became so infamous that even ancient writers, notorious for exaggeration, couldn't decide what was real and what was too shocking to be true. They said Messalina married Emperor Claudius when she was barely 15, a teenager thrust into the world's most dangerous political court. Claudius was old enough to be her grandfather, a stammering scholar whom few ever expected to become emperor. When he did, after the chaotic assassination of Caligula, Messalina suddenly found herself empress of the Roman world. And that's where her story truly begins. From the moment she entered the palace, whispers followed her. She was said to be stunningly beautiful, with dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets and a smile that could both charm and destroy. But it wasn't her beauty that terrified Rome. It was her hunger. In a city where power and pleasure were intertwined, Messalina played both games better than anyone. Senators feared her. Generals desired her. Servants obeyed her with trembling hands. And Claudius? He adored her. He trusted her so completely that he gave her more influence than any woman had ever wielded in the imperial household. But with that trust came opportunity, and Messalina took it. The Roman historian Juvenal wrote that she would slip out of the palace at night, barefoot, disguised with a blonde wig, and sneak into the city's brothels. There she allegedly worked under a false name, taking men all night until dawn, then returned to the palace to greet her husband as if nothing had happened. The ancient biographers couldn't decide if this was true or a malicious fantasy invented by her enemies. But one thing was certain: Rome believed it. To the people, the Empress of Rome wasn't just powerful. She was insatiable. Behind the walls of the Palatine Hill, the stories they said she hosted secret feasts where senators' wives were forced to perform acts of debauchery for her amusement. That she competed with prostitutes to see who could take the most lovers in a single night. That her garden parties ended in ritual orgies so depraved even Caligula, her predecessor and cousin, would have blushed. And while these stories may have been embroidered by gossip and politics, they captured something real: Rome's fascination and fear of female power tied to sexuality, because Rome had long tolerated the excesses of its men. Emperors could indulge, generals could take lovers, and even priests could stray. But a woman, especially an empress, who wielded her sexuality as a weapon, that was dangerous. It upended everything the Roman patriarchy believed about order and control. Messalina's lovers weren't just random men in the shadows. Many were senators, poets, actors, men whose careers she could make or destroy with a whisper. She rewarded those who pleased her with estates, titles, even military posts. Those who disappointed her sometimes vanished entirely, their names erased from records, their families ruined. And yet, despite all the rumors, Claudius remained oblivious. He was, after all, a man of study more than suspicion, a historian, a linguist, a lover of books rather than intrigues. While he pored over scrolls, his empress rewrote the rules of desire. Some modern historians think Messalina's scandal was exaggerated by later writers like Tacitus and Suetonius, men who despised powerful women. They argue she was a political scapegoat, blamed for Rome's own moral decay. But the legends persisted because they revealed something the Romans themselves couldn't look away from: their own fascination with forbidden pleasure. The story that sealed her fate began, according to one chronicler, at a feast unlike any other. By then, Messalina's influence had become absolute. She controlled access to the emperor, orchestrated marriages, and determined who rose and fell in Roman society. And yet, with all her power, she was restless. She wanted something no woman in Rome had ever dared to want: freedom. Not political freedom, but personal freedom. The right to love whom she pleased, when she pleased. Enter Gaius Silius, a handsome young nobleman, rumored to be the most beautiful man in Rome. He was a senator, athletic, ambitious, and already married. But to Messalina, he was irresistible. The two began a passionate affair so reckless that it shocked even their decadent peers. She openly flaunted him in public, showered him with gifts, and whispered that she would one day make him emperor. Then came the moment that would destroy them both. One autumn night, while Claudius was away at Ostia inspecting harbors, Messalina and Silius staged what ancient writers described as a mock wedding, complete with guests, musicians, and a dowry. Whether it was a symbolic ritual, a drunken parody, or a genuine act of madness, it was interpreted by her enemies as high treason. The Empress of Rome had married another man while her husband, the emperor, still lived. When word reached Claudius, the empire trembled. His advisors, terrified of Messalina's influence, convinced him she planned to overthrow him. Silius was arrested and executed. Messalina, frantic, fled to the gardens of Lucullus, the same gardens where she once held her decadent feasts. She begged for mercy, sent messages to Claudius through their children, and even tried to charm the soldiers sent to kill her. But it was no use. The emperor, heartbroken and humiliated, turned away. And so, at barely 23 years old, the woman who once ruled Rome's desires was cornered among her roses, trembling, and finally forced to take her own life. Yet her story didn't die with her. If anything, it grew, into legend, into scandal, into myth. Later emperors would invoke her name as a warning. Playwrights would resurrect her as a symbol of lust and betrayal, and centuries later, her name would become synonymous with female depravity. But beneath that reputation lies a haunting question. Was Messalina truly the monster Rome claimed she was, or merely a reflection of Rome's own obsessions, magnified through the eyes of jealous men? In the next part of our journey, we'll step deeper into that question, exploring how Messalina's legend evolved, how Roman society turned her into both a villain and a fantasy, and why her name endured long after her body turned to dust. Because the truth about Rome's most perverted empress isn't just about sex, it's about power, perception, and the dangerous game of desire that can bring even empires to their knees. They said that after Messalina's body was carried from the gardens, Rome fell silent. For years, she had been the pulse of the imperial court, feared, desired, and watched by every eye. But now, her death left a vacuum that the empire rushed to fill with stories. The courtiers whispered that Claudius, upon learning of her execution, asked to see his wife and had to be reminded she was gone. Some claimed he wept for her. Others said he ate dinner in silence, staring into nothing, while the rest of Rome feasted at her downfall. It was as if the empire itself exhaled. A collective sigh of relief that the woman who had so scandalized it was no more. But what followed wasn't mourning. It was storytelling. And in those stories, Messalina's legend began to mutate. Ancient Rome was obsessed with narrative. Every public figure was either a hero or a cautionary tale. The historians who wrote after her death, men like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal, didn't just record events. They sculpted morality plays out of them. In their hands, Messalina became something more than a woman. She became a symbol. To them, she represented the chaos that came when lust ruled power, when a woman stepped beyond her prescribed role and played the game of men. In Tacitus's annals, her story is told with a mix of disgust and fascination. He describes her appetite for pleasure as something almost supernatural, as though she was possessed by an ancient spirit of excess. Juvenal, ever the satirist, sharpened her legend even further. He turned her into the star of one of his most infamous passages, where the Empress sneaks into a brothel to compete with prostitutes, leaving only when she's exhausted every man who entered. Was it true? Almost certainly not. But that wasn't the point. To Juvenal, Messalina wasn't a person. She was the embodiment of Rome's own hypocrisy. Because the same empire that condemned her had also built entire neighborhoods devoted to pleasure. Rome's Subura district buzzed with taverns, brothels, and bathhouses that catered to every imaginable taste. Senators who publicly scorned immorality often kept slaves for their own private amusements. The theater, the baths, even the temples, all became spaces where desire and power mixed freely. In such a world, the story of Messalina didn't sound entirely impossible. It sounded like a mirror. After her death, her name was systematically erased from monuments. Her statues were smashed, her images destroyed, a process known as damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. But erasing a name never erased curiosity. Rome was fascinated by her, even as it pretended to despise her. Poets invoked her as a warning to men, beware the beautiful wife. Painters and sculptors revived her image in secret. Some even whispered prayers to her, as though she had become a goddess of forbidden pleasure, a dark Venus haunting the empire that betrayed her. Then came Agrippina, Claudius's new wife, the mother of Nero, and another woman who would one day be accused of equal, if not greater, ambition. She studied Messalina's fate closely. She knew that Rome's moral outrage was selective, that its senators tolerated almost any cruelty, but never female autonomy. Agrippina learned to wield power differently, not through open desire, but through control, manipulation, and fear. In a way, she was Messalina's heir, proof that the game could still be played, if only one learned the right disguise. Meanwhile, among the people, Messalina's story transformed, yet again. The more it was retold, the more it became myth. Some claimed her ghost wandered the Palatine Hill at night, searching for her lost lovers. Others said she appeared in dreams, offering advice to young women about the price of beauty and ambition. Centuries later, Christian chroniclers would take up her name, reshaping it as an example of pagan corruption. To them, Messalina was not just a scandalous empress, she was proof that Rome had fallen because it had lost its virtue. And yet, beneath those layers of condemnation, a different story persisted. A handful of Roman women, widows, courtesans, and freed slaves, began quietly invoking her as a figure of defiance. To them, she symbolized something forbidden but thrilling: female agency. In a world where women were property, Messalina had for a brief moment been the most powerful person alive, not because of her birthright, but because she dared to use what she had been taught to hide. Over time, her myth began to echo in art. Roman frescoes from Pompeii depict women reclining at banquets, gazing directly at viewers with knowing eyes. Scholars debate whether these scenes were inspired by Messalina, the confident woman who refused to lower her gaze. Later poets described her as the woman who looked at Rome and saw a toy. For an empire built on conquest, such a reversal of power was terrifying. The legend grew even more elaborate with time. By the late empire, storytellers claimed that Messalina had kept a secret chamber beneath the palace, a mirrored hall where every wall reflected her lovers, and every act was recorded in sculpture or painting. Of course, no such chamber has ever been found, but the story persisted, surviving into medieval manuscripts and Renaissance plays. Even in the imagination of later centuries, Rome's most perverted empress remained alive, still seducing history itself. What fascinates historians today is not whether these stories were true, but why they endured. Why did Rome, and later Europe, need Messalina to be the villain? Perhaps because she represented a truth societies rarely admit: that power and sexuality are inseparable forces. Rome could tolerate cruelty, excess, even madness in its emperors, but not open desire in its women. By turning Messalina into a monster, Rome could absolve itself of guilt. She became the scapegoat for every indulgence the empire itself refused to confront. And still in the cracks of her legend we glimpse something human, a young woman thrust into unimaginable power surrounded by predators, trying to carve a place for herself in a world that never saw her as anything but decoration. If she played the game with too much passion, it was because she knew she could never win by the rules. The empire moved on, of course. Claudius remarried, then died, poisoned, many believed, by Agrippina. Nero took the throne, and Rome's decadence reached new, almost theatrical heights. But even amid Nero's infamous orgies and his mother's manipulations, the name Messalina lingered. She was the ghost at every banquet, the warning in every whisper. When new scandals arose, people said, "Ah, another Messalina." Over the centuries, her story became shorthand for dangerous women. Medieval writers called adulterous queens Messalinas. Renaissance artists painted her as a temptress, surrounded by symbols of lust, pearls, roses, and overturned goblets. In the 18th century, playwrights revived her as the ultimate cautionary tale. Beauty, corrupted by desire. And yet, every retelling betrayed a fascination that bordered on admiration, because no matter how much they condemned her, they couldn't look away. Perhaps that's the real legacy of Messalina. Not the scandal itself, but the way it exposed the contradictions at the heart of power. The empire that called itself moral was also addicted to spectacle. The men who wrote laws against adultery were the same who filled their villas with lovers and feasts. The senators who judged her reveled in her downfall as though it were theater. And maybe it was. Maybe Messalina understood that better than anyone. That Rome, for all its grandeur, was always performing. Her legend reminds us that history isn't written by the victors alone. It's written by those who survive long enough to tell the story. And Messalina, in her own way, did. Through the centuries, through every retelling, she remains a mirror, reflecting what each age fears most in women, and perhaps what it secretly desires. Long after Messalina's death, Rome still could not stop talking about her. The empire had seen tyrants and assassins, mad emperors and cruel generals, yet none haunted its imagination quite like the Empress whose desires had, supposedly, toppled thrones. Her name passed from gossip to legend, whispered in the same breath as the gods of love and madness. And somewhere between history and myth, she began to take on a second life, one that blurred the line between woman and deity. Jupiter thundered over its temples, Mars guarded its armies, and Venus watched over every affair of the heart. But in the years following Messalina's fall, a strange transformation began to take place in the way Romans thought about love, lust, and punishment. Stories of her escapades merged with older myths of Venus, of the goddess whose beauty and jealousy could destroy kingdoms. Some artists began to depict Venus with Messalina's features: a sly half-smile, a cascade of curls, eyes that hinted at secrets no mortal could hold. To the devout, it was blasphemy. To the curious, it was irresistible. In private villas along the Bay of Naples, frescoes began to appear showing an unnamed empress at the center of feasts where mortals and gods mingled freely. In some, she reclined among satyrs. In others, she poured wine for Bacchus himself. Whether the painters intended her to be Messalina or Venus, no one said aloud. But the resemblance was unmistakable. Patrons requested these images in secret, hiding them behind curtains or in small chambers accessible only by trusted guests. Archaeologists centuries later would uncover them beneath the ash of Vesuvius, their colors still vibrant, the faces still hauntingly alive. Rome's mystery cults, those secret brotherhoods that promised salvation through hidden knowledge, began weaving stories of a mortal woman whose passion defied the gods. In the rites of Bacchus, initiates reenacted tales of drunken ecstasy and divine possession, and some whispered that Messalina herself had once been an initiate. The Christians who later condemned these rites would call her the Bride of Bacchus, claiming her excesses were a form of worship. The truth is lost, but the rumor reveals something profound about the age. For a society built on control, Messalina had become the embodiment of surrender. The philosopher Seneca, who lived during her lifetime, wrote bitterly that the Roman elite had turned pleasure into a religion. To him, people like Messalina were symptoms of a deeper sickness, the hunger for novelty that no feast could satisfy. Yet even Seneca, moralist that he was, could not resist describing her with almost poetic fascination. There are those, he wrote, whose beauty is a flame that consumes the city that adores it. Over the next generations, her story was folded into the city's rituals in subtle ways. During the Floralia, the festival of flowers and fertility, actresses danced nearly nude before cheering crowds, a tradition that conservative senators tried to ban year after year. The dancers wore masks modeled after famous courtesans, and occasionally one would appear with the unmistakable likeness of the late Empress. The crowd would roar, half in scandal, half in delight. In their laughter was a strange kind of nostalgia, for a time when even the palace had burned with forbidden joy. Meanwhile, poets reimagined her downfall as tragedy rather than sin. In one lost play, said to have been performed during Nero's reign, Messalina appears before the gods to plead her case. She argues that her desires were no worse than those of Jupiter, who chased mortal women without consequence. The gods fall silent, unable to refute her logic. It was a dangerous story to tell in public, and the script vanished soon after. But the idea lingered. Perhaps Messalina had not been wicked, only human in a world that punished humanity. In the centuries that followed, as Christianity spread across the empire, her image changed again. To the new faith, she was a convenient symbol of everything Rome had done wrong. Preachers thundered about her from pulpits, describing her as the living proof that paganism led only to ruin. They told stories of her spirit condemned to wander the ruins of her own palaces, forever seeking repentance. Pilgrims claimed to see her face in the moonlight over the forum, her jeweled hands reaching for forgiveness. These tales, half sermon and half ghost story, gave her legend a new kind of immortality. Yet curiously, even Christian scribes could not resist the strange glamour of her story. Illuminated manuscripts copied in monasteries preserved her name alongside moral warnings, and the monks' illustrations sometimes betrayed more fascination than disgust. Margins bloomed with tiny painted figures of a woman surrounded by flowers, serpents, and wine cups. Perhaps the artists understood what their preachers denied. That sin told well can never quite be silenced. What makes Messalina's endurance remarkable is how adaptable her myth became. Every age remade her according to its desires. To the pagans, she was the last devotee of Venus. Even now, historians find themselves drawn to her with the same mixture of curiosity and disbelief that filled the writings of her contemporaries. Modern excavations of Claudius' palace have turned up fragments of inscriptions once chiseled away, letters that might have spelled her name. The erasure was incomplete, as though history itself refused to let her vanish. Among those ruins, archaeologists discovered a small bronze mirror, delicately worked, dating to the very years of her reign. Some like to imagine it was hers. On its back, engraved in fine script, are the words Speculum Vitae, the mirror of life, a fitting symbol for a woman who reflected the empire's most intimate contradictions. For in the end, Messalina was never just about scandal. Her story laid bare the uneasy marriage between virtue and pleasure that defined Rome. She showed how power could intoxicate, how love could become strategy, and how a single life could become a lens through which an entire civilization examined its soul. By the time of Nero's downfall, the Romans had begun to see their own decadence mirrored in the tales they told of her. The games grew bloodier, the feasts grander, but the laughter more hollow. Poets wrote elegies comparing the city itself to Messalina, beautiful, beloved, and doomed by its desires. When the empire finally fractured, many would say it was not barbarians who destroyed it, but the same hunger that had consumed its empress. Still, the legend refused to die. In the centuries after Rome's fall, travelers wandering its ruins told stories of a mysterious woman whose laughter echoed through the marble halls at night. They said she appeared to those who had loved too much or too recklessly, offering both warning and comfort. The poets called her the spirit of the Palatine, a muse of pleasure and regret. So, was Messalina a sinner, a victim, or a goddess reborn? Perhaps she was all three. The truth lies somewhere between the historian's ink and the artist's brushstroke, between the sermon and the whispered story told by candlelight. Each generation finds its own Messalina, and in doing so, reveals something about itself. And if you listen closely, wandering through the ruins of ancient Rome, you might almost hear her still. The faint rustle of silk, the echo of laughter, the sound of a woman who refused to be forgotten. When the Roman Empire crumbled, its cities fell silent, but its stories did not. Across the Middle Ages, monks copied the histories of Tacitus and Suetonius by candlelight, preserving every scandal with the same care they gave to scripture. Within those brittle pages, Messalina waited. To the cloistered scribes who barely knew a woman's face beyond a painted saint, she seemed almost mythic, a warning carved in ink about what happens when desire slips its leash. And yet, the more they copied her name, the more alive she became. By the 15th century, Europe had begun to rediscover the classical world. Scholars in Florence and Venice scoured the ruins of Rome, unearthing marble fragments of forgotten emperors and half-broken inscriptions. Among them, they found hints of Messalina. An antiquarian named Poggio Bracciolini wrote that he had seen a bust of a young matron with a gaze at once proud and sorrowful, and though the inscription was lost, he was sure it was hers. Whether he was right hardly mattered. The Renaissance needed symbols, and she arrived just in time. Painters found her irresistible. In the studios of northern Italy, canvases bloomed with half-imagined scenes from the imperial palace. Messalina appeared draped in pearls, reclining beside silver bowls of fruit, her expression caught between arrogance and melancholy. Artists claimed to be illustrating Roman virtue conquered by sin, but their brushstrokes lingered lovingly on every fold of silk, every bare shoulder. Collectors whispered that a painting of Messalina brought luck and love, an echo, perhaps, of the pagan charms once carved with her likeness. Poets followed the painter's lead. In one Venetian manuscript, a verse cycle called "The Fall of the Proud" describes Messalina's final night as a pageant of color and perfume. The moonlight on marble, the scent of roses wilting in her garden, the silence before the soldiers arrive. The poet ends not with her death, but with a question. Was she not Rome itself, too rich to live, too loved to last? In that line, we glimpse how the Renaissance saw her, not as a sinner to condemn, but as an allegory of beauty undone by excess. As printing spread, her story escaped the libraries and entered the streets. Broadsheets and chapbooks retold her adventures in language meant to thrill. Readers devoured tales of the Empress who disguised herself to roam the night, of the rival she poisoned, of the lovers who begged for her favor. Most of it was invention, but few cared. To a world shaking off medieval restraint, Messalina was an emblem of forbidden freedom, the woman who did what others only dreamed. The Church, of course, reacted. Preachers warned that her ghost had returned to tempt the faithful. In Rome itself, a Dominican friar declared from the pulpit that the city's new luxury was the second coming of Messalina. Yet even in condemnation, there was admiration. The sermons railed, but the stories sold. By the 17th century, playwrights across Europe were putting her on stage. In London, a tragedy called The Roman Empress drew full houses. The audience gasped as Messalina walked barefoot among her courtiers, daring any man to match her courage. When the soldiers came for her, she did not beg. She laughed. The line that closed the play became famous. Tell them, Rome has killed its own desire. It was meant as moral instruction, but the crowd cheered her defiance instead. France embraced her next. During Louis XIV's reign, when court life itself resembled a Roman pageant, Poets compared the king's mistresses to Messalina, sometimes in admiration, sometimes in warning. The palace gossip at Versailles echoed the same tension that had filled the Palatine centuries before, fascination with pleasure and fear of its power. When Molière joked that every court breeds its Messalina, he meant it as satire, but the name had already turned glamorous. Even scholars could not resist rewriting her. The historian Pierre Bayle tried to separate fact from legend, scouring Latin sources to prove that most of her supposed crimes were exaggerations. Yet his very defense made her famous again. Readers devoured his footnotes where rumor and reality danced side by side. In the salons of Paris, people began speaking of the real Messalina, as if she were a misunderstood heroine who might, in another age, have been celebrated rather than condemned. Meanwhile, artists across Europe turned her into a symbol of feminine power. Sculptors carved marble figures titled Messalina, contemplating her fate. Serene women gazing into empty space, the suggestion of sorrow softening their beauty. The Victorians later collected these works as curiosities, pretending moral interest while enjoying the sensual lines. The name still carried scandal, but also sophistication. By the 19th century, the world had changed again. Archaeologists returned to the Palatine Hill, uncovering what they believed to be fragments of Claudius's household. Each discovery revived her legend. Newspapers published serialized histories filled with imagined diaries and secret letters. The public devoured every word. To an age caught between prudery and fascination with sex, Messalina offered both excuse and thrill. Writers described her as the first modern woman, not because of what she did, but because she lived according to her own desire. Opera companies staged her story with sweeping arias of seduction and betrayal. In paintings, she stood beside Cleopatra and Salome, the eternal triad of dangerous beauty. The moral was always the same. Love destroys, but what a glorious destruction it is. Even as moralists shook their heads, audiences leaned forward, spellbound. And then came the 20th century, when film discovered her. Silent epics like Messalina, Empress of Passion, filled theaters with scenes of marble halls and glittering orgies. The censorship boards cut as much as they could, but audiences still saw enough to keep the legend alive. Later, in the decades of black and white cinema, she appeared again, sometimes as villain, sometimes as tragic heroine, always as the woman who dared. Historians trying to reclaim the truth have since argued that most of what we know about her tells us more about the storytellers than about Messalina herself. To the ancients, she was a warning. To the Renaissance, a muse. To the modern world, a fascination. The only constant was that her story never really belonged to her. Each generation rewrote it to mirror its own anxieties about sex, power, and freedom. If there is something eternal in her myth, it is that uneasy recognition, the sense that within the tale of one woman lies the reflection of many societies. Her name survived the empire that condemned her, outlived the faiths that tried to erase her, and persisted even when the stones of Rome itself crumbled. And perhaps that is her quiet revenge. For all the attempts to silence or moralize her, Messalina remains a voice from the past that refuses to fade, a reminder that the line between virtue and desire is drawn, erased, and redrawn with every age. Centuries pass, and yet the woman Rome tried to erase keeps resurfacing. Each generation finds her again, sometimes in the dust of archaeology, sometimes in the pages of a novel, sometimes flickering across a screen. What began as the gossip of senators has become an endless conversation about power, morality, and the stories we tell about desire. In the 20th century, as scholars re-examined ancient history with new eyes, Messalina's name returned to classrooms and journals. Historians began to notice how the same men who wrote of her uncontrolled lust also praised emperors for their conquests. The language of virtue and vice, they realized, had always been political. To discredit an emperor's wife was to weaken his legitimacy. Claudius' enemies had found in Messalina a perfect target, one who could be blamed for every whisper of corruption. The archaeological record offered little to confirm the scandals. No secret chambers, no incriminating inscriptions. What it did reveal were traces of a woman involved in charity, in the patronage of artists, in the ceremonial duties expected of an empress. Coins bearing her image showed a dignified matron crowned with laurel. The contrast between those calm profiles and the stories of nocturnal debauchery was almost absurd. Modern historians began to suspect that the most perverted empress had been, at least in part, a convenient fiction. But even when scholarship cleared the smoke, the myth refused to fade. Novelists and filmmakers preferred the legend. A true Messalina, quiet, intelligent, politically capable, was less exciting than the woman who supposedly ruled the night. The legend gave storytellers what history rarely provides: drama, danger, beauty, and a moral that could mean anything. In the 1960s, when cinema grew bolder, Italian directors turned her into an icon of rebellion. Their Messalina was not a warning, but a celebration, a woman who refused to bow to hypocrisy. Actresses posed as her on glossy magazine covers, framed not by marble columns but by neon lights. Reviewers called her the first feminist of Rome, though few of them meant it seriously. Still, the idea stuck. Perhaps the real scandal had been that she lived on her own terms. Academics picked up the thread. Feminist historians began reading her story as a case study in how patriarchy survives through narrative. They compared the treatment of Messalina to that of other infamous women: Cleopatra, Catherine de' Medici, Marie Antoinette, each blamed for the sins of the men around them. One scholar wrote that Messalina's true crime was not desire, but visibility. In a culture that expected women to serve quietly, she had been impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, popular culture kept reinventing her. In television dramas, she became the dark mirror of modern celebrity, beautiful, hounded, and consumed by public fascination. In fashion photography, she appeared in pearls and metallic fabrics, a hybrid of ancient empress and modern icon. Even music videos borrowed her name. Pop stars posed before marble backdrops, playing at Roman decadence while singing about freedom, and so the cycle continued. Every retelling said as much about the present as about the past. In times of conservatism, she returned as a warning. In eras of liberation, she re-emerged as a muse. Messalina, the young woman who died in a garden 2,000 years ago, had become a shape that history could not hold still. Yet somewhere beneath the artifice, a human story remains. Imagine her not as a symbol, but as a person. A teenager married to a man 3 times her age, thrust into a palace where survival depended on charm and instinct. Imagine the fear behind the luxury, the calculations required simply to stay alive among courtiers who plotted with every smile. In that light, even the wildest rumors begin to look less like evidence of vice and more like the distorted reflections of a frightened world that could not comprehend her. Because Messalina lived at a moment when Rome was changing. The empire's power had grown so vast that it began to turn inward, feeding on spectacle. The people demanded distraction, gladiators, feasts, stories of excess. When real life failed to provide it, the imagination did. The Empress became the stage on which Rome performed its anxieties. Her supposed perversions were the empire's own, projected onto her body. When modern viewers watch films or read about her today, they're participating in that same ritual. To study Messalina is to confront our own fascination with scandal. We claim to search for truth, but what we crave is the thrill of transgression safely contained within a story. We want the forbidden without the consequence. The Romans wanted the same. That may be why her legend has never died. It feeds a hunger that every age carries. Walk through the ruins of the Palatine Hill today, and the city hums around you, 1,000 years of history stacked in layers of stone. Tourists pause at the broken columns of Claudius's palace. Guides mention his murdered wife in a single sentence before moving on. But if you stand there long enough, the silence fills with echoes. Somewhere beyond the noise of the modern city, you can almost hear the murmur of the ancient court, the rustle of silk, the laughter that once echoed down marble corridors. Messalina is there still, not as ghost or goddess, but as memory, the part of history that refuses to behave. Her story, stripped of invention, still carries weight. It reminds us that every society writes its own morality plays and casts its own villains. It warns that power always provokes fear, and that women who wield it are often remembered not for what they did, but for what others needed them to represent. And it shows, perhaps more clearly than any inscription or monument, how desire and judgment entwine in the human heart. For Rome, she was a scandal. For later ages, a mirror. For us, a question that still matters. How much of what we call morality is simply the story we tell about other people's pleasure? The ruins have no answer, only the quiet shimmer of the Tiber below, and the sun setting over the Forum. Somewhere between the stones and the stories lies the real Messalina, elusive, complex, and endlessly rewritten, and that brings us back to you. Which version of her story do you believe? Was she the monster the historians described, the victim of their politics, or the myth that centuries of fascination created? Tell us in the comments what surprised you most about Rome's most infamous empress. If you enjoyed this journey through the hidden side of ancient history, make sure to subscribe to Histories of Desire. Every week we explore the forgotten loves, scandals, and obsessions that shaped civilizations, and the ways those passions still echo in our own. Because history, like desire, never truly dies. It only changes its face.